6:09 a.m. at Astra Wing Executive Airport. A cold blue mist clings to a multi-million-dollar private jet prepping for a billion-dollar merger flight. Catherine Vale, the iron-willed CEO, strides toward the stairs with icy silence. Security is absolute, yet Daniel Ross, a single-dad mechanic, stands paralyzed in the restricted zone. His gut is screaming. Catherine's voice cuts like a whip. "You don't belong here." As security drags him away, the engines roar, releasing a micro-vibration only Daniel's ears can catch. The countdown begins. No one else hears the sound of a lethal disaster waiting to ignite. The tarmac at Astra Wing Executive Airport at 6 in the morning always smelled like jet fuel and missed sleep. For Daniel Ross, it was the scent of a long shift coming to an end. He had been on the runway since 4 a.m., meticulously working through the early morning maintenance logs so he could finish in time to pick up his 8-year-old daughter, Mia, from school. Mia was the center of his universe, a bright-eyed girl who still believed her dad was a superhero because he could make giant metal birds fly. Daniel wasn't just any mechanic, he was a whisperer of machines. While the younger technicians relied heavily on their sleek digital diagnostic tablets and AI-driven checklists, Daniel relied on a decades-old intuition forged in the belly of heavy military transport planes. He was famous among the crew for being annoyingly meticulous. He was the man who checked the backup systems of the backup systems. He lived by a simple, unyielding rule. The metal never lies, but the sensors often do. His toolbox was a battered olive-drab chest, filled with instruments that had seen service on 3 different continents. While the younger techs laughed at his analog pressure gauges, Daniel knew that digital displays could be fooled by a software glitch or a faulty thermocouple. He trusted the physical resistance of a bolt, the specific pitch of a hydraulic pump, and the way the air shimmered around a hot exhaust. 1 week ago, during a routine maintenance check on the Vale Global fleet, Daniel had detected something. It was a transient pressure fluctuation in the auxiliary power unit, APU, of the lead jet. It was a mere flicker, a momentary dip that lasted less than a millisecond. He had filed a formal report, flagging it for a deep dive inspection. But in the high-velocity world of Astra Wing, where time is measured in millions of dollars and delay is considered a corporate sin, his report had been buried. The management deemed it a non-critical sensor anomaly. Commercial priority had pushed it to the absolute bottom of the pile. "Ross, you're overthinking it again," his supervisor had told him with a dismissive wave. "The Astra Wing 7 is the most advanced jet in the world. It has 3 redundant AI systems. If there was a real problem, the computer would be screaming. Just sign the log and go home to your kid." But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling. He spent his nights reading old engineering journals, tracing the schematics of the bleed air assembly in his head. He realized that the new composite materials used in the wing root had a slightly different thermal expansion coefficient than the titanium valves they were connected to. Under specific atmospheric conditions, high humidity, followed by rapid heating, the seal could microscopically warp. Catherine Vale didn't care about anomalies or thermal expansion. At 38, she had climbed to the top of the corporate ladder by being the most efficient person in any room. She lived by protocols. She breathed efficiency. Today was the most important day of her career. A flight to Zurich to sign a merger that would redefine the global aerospace market. To her, the jet was just a tool, like a pen or a laptop. It worked because it was supposed to work. She had no time for gut feelings or mechanics with theories. She stepped out of her black sedan, her heels clicking rhythmically on the asphalt like a ticking clock. Behind her, a phalanx of junior executives scrambled to keep up, their tablets glowing with market data. Catherine didn't look at the sky or the sunrise. She looked at her watch. 6:11 a.m. They were 2 minutes behind her ideal schedule. As Catherine approached the aircraft, she saw Daniel lingering near the starboard landing gear. He was looking at a specific access panel, his forehead creased in deep worry. He wasn't holding a tablet. He was pressing his bare hand against the fuselage, feeling for a phantom pulse. To Catherine, he looked out of place. Grease-stained jumpsuit, weathered skin, and a look of doubt that didn't fit the confident aesthetic of her brand. "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" she asked, her voice dripping with calculated impatience. Just checking the bleed air valves, ma'am, Daniel replied, not looking up immediately. The cycle felt heavy this morning. The humidity is high, and the pressure return is sluggish. Catherine didn't even slow down. She stopped only to adjust her blazer, looking at Daniel as if he were a piece of debris that had accidentally blown onto her runway. The engineers signed off on the checklist 10 minutes ago. We are on a window of 3 minutes for takeoff. You don't belong in this perimeter anymore. Leave the technical work to the people with the badges and the degrees. The head of security, Henderson, stepped forward. He placed a firm, non-negotiable hand on Daniel's shoulder. You heard the lady, Ross. Shift's over. Move it. You're cluttering the visual for the departure photos. Daniel didn't fight it. He was a single father with a mortgage and a daughter who needed him. He couldn't afford to be the difficult employee. He stripped off his heavy work gloves, wiped his hands on a rag, and handed over his temporary gate pass. As he walked toward the perimeter fence, he felt a strange hollow sensation in his chest. The same feeling he'd had right before a structural failure took down a transport plane in his Army days. A young engineer named Marcus, barely 25 and fresh out of school, watched Daniel go. Marcus held the diagnostic tablet that said everything was perfectly green. For a second the boy hesitated, looking from the tablet to the retreating back of the veteran mechanic. He had seen Daniel's report last week. He knew Daniel was never wrong, but Marcus wanted a promotion, and challenging Catherine Vale on her own runway was not the way to get one. Daniel reached the edge of the airfield, his hand gripping the cold chain-link fence. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Mia. Dad, are you done yet? You promised we'd get pancakes after school. And you said you'd show me how the landing lights work. Almost done, Peanut, Daniel said, forcing a smile into his voice. I'm just watching the big birds wake up. I'll be there soon. But as he spoke, the jet's engine surged for the final pre-taxi test. It was a sound Daniel knew by heart, the clean, rhythmic whistle of a perfectly tuned turbine. But then, right at the peak of the surge, he heard it, a micro shudder, a rhythmic vibration that lasted exactly 3 cycles before disappearing into the roar. It wasn't a sound of the engine, it was the sound of air escaping where it shouldn't. The countdown on the tower display was running. The jet was beginning to move. Daniel stood at the edge of the fence, his eyes locked on the specialized wing root of the Astrowing executive. His heart began to hammer. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a thermal expansion leak in the high-pressure line. At takeoff thrust, that leak wouldn't just be an anomaly, it would be a blowtorch directed at the fuel lines. Daniel Ross made a choice. He didn't head for the parking lot. He turned back toward the security gate, running at full speed. The security booth at Gate 4 was manned by a guard who had seen Daniel every morning for 3 years. But today the rules were ironclad. The Vale departure was a red-tier event. No unauthorized personnel. Period. Daniel, stop! You can't go back there, the guard shouted, stepping out and reaching for his holster. Call the tower. Tell them to abort the taxi. Daniel screamed over the rising noise of the turbines. There's a pressure leak in the starboard wing root. It's going to ignite on the rotation. The boards are all green, Ross. Get back. If you cross that line, I'm authorized to use force. Daniel didn't stop. He knew the geography of the airport better than the architects. He bypassed the main gate, sliding through a narrow gap in the equipment hangar, tearing his jumpsuit in the process. He had less than 10 minutes before the jet reached V1, the point of no return. Inside the cockpit of the Vale Global jet, Catherine Vale was already looking at her briefing notes, her mind already in Zurich. The pilots were focused on the taxiway, following the lead car. The atmosphere was calm, professional, and entirely oblivious to the catastrophe brewing inches beneath the floorboards. Checklist complete, the captain said. Thrust set to take off power. Wind is 5 knots. Perfect day for a record-breaking flight. Daniel reached the tarmac, waving his arms frantically at the ground crew. A supervisor saw him and signaled for security. 2 black SUVs began to peel across the concrete, sirens silent but lights flashing. They weren't coming to help Daniel. They were coming to neutralize a perceived threat. Daniel didn't care. He found a headset on a parked tug and jammed it onto his ears, switching to the emergency ground frequency. Astra Wing Tower, this is Ross. Tech ID 402. Do not, I repeat, do not let Vale Alpha take the runway. There is a catastrophic failure in the bleed air assembly. The secondary seal has breached. There was a crackle of static. Tech 402, you are on an unauthorized frequency. Clear the area or we will use force. This is your final warning. Daniel looked at the jet. It was now lining up at the head of runway 2. The roar was deafening, a physical wall of sound. He could see the heat haze shimmering behind the engines. He could also see a tiny, almost invisible wisp of white vapor venting from the wing root. To anyone else, it looked like simple condensation. To Daniel, it was the white flag of a dying plane. He ran toward the jet, ignoring the security vehicles closing in. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be a father who could look his daughter in the eye. He knew that if that jet took off, Catherine Vale and 6 other people wouldn't survive the first 1,000 feet. He saw the faces of the flight attendants through the windows, young women with lives and families. Catherine Vale looked out the window and saw a figure running toward them. She recognized the grease-stained jumpsuit, now torn at the shoulder. "Is that the same man from before?" she asked the lead pilot over the intercom. "What is he doing? Why hasn't security handled this?" "Security is handling it, ma'am. Just a disgruntled employee, likely looking for a moment of fame," the pilot replied, his hand on the throttle. "We are cleared for takeoff, increasing thrust." The engines began to howl. The jet started to roll. Daniel felt the wind of the turbines pushing him back, nearly knocking him off his feet. He was losing. The SUVs were seconds away from pinning him. He looked at the wing again. The vibration he had heard earlier was now visible. The metal skin of the access panel was vibrating at a frequency that shouldn't exist. It was a flutter, the precursor to structural disintegration. He realized the engineers were looking at static thresholds, data collected while the plane was sitting still. But as the plane moved, as the wind hit the surfaces and the temperature changed, the aerodynamics were shifting. The dynamic threshold was being exceeded. It was a fundamental engineering error that the software was programmed to overlook as noise. "Stop!" Daniel roared into the headset, his voice breaking. "Look at the secondary pressure return. Marcus, if you're listening, look at the delta P. It's not the engine, it's the line." In the support van, Marcus, the young engineer, froze. He heard Daniel's voice through the open comms. He looked down at his tablet. For a split second, he saw it. A flicker. A spike in the data that the automated system was trying to smooth out. The delta P was off by 3%. It was small, but in a pressurized system at takeoff, 3% was everything. "Tower, wait," Marcus started, his voice trembling. But the tower was focused on the schedule. Daniel reached the edge of the runway, the security guards tackling him to the ground. His face was pressed into the hot concrete, the smell of burnt rubber filling his nostrils. He could feel the vibration of the jet through the earth. "Check the valve!" Daniel screamed one last time, even as the handcuffs clicked onto his wrists. "Check the damn valve!" Catherine Vale felt the jet accelerate. The force pushed her back into her seat. She looked at the wing root one more time, and then she saw it. A spark. A tiny orange flash that didn't belong in the blue morning light. In that final moment of Act 2, as the jet reached 120 knots, a secondary alarm finally tripped in the cockpit. Not a green light, not a yellow light. A bright, bleeding red. And then came the sound of a muffled explosion. The cockpit erupted into a chaos of digital warnings. "Master warning! Bleed air temp high! Starboard wing fire! V1!" the co-pilot shouted. They were at the speed where they were supposed to be committed to the air, but the alarm was screaming that the wing was about to melt. "Abort! Abort!" Catherine heard the pilot scream. The brakes slammed on. The tires shrieked against the asphalt, smoke billowing as the anti-lock system fought the massive momentum. The jet shuddered, veering slightly to the left before coming to a violent, jarring halt just hundreds of feet from the end of the runway. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Catherine Vale sat in her leather seat, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked out the window. Fire crews were already racing toward the starboard wing, spraying foam over the smoking metal. The fire was out, but the wing root was a blackened mess of melted composite. She looked toward the edge of the tarmac. She saw the SUVs. She saw the man in the grease-stained jumpsuit being pulled to his feet by security. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was just watching the plane, his eyes filled with a haunting sadness. He looked like a man who had seen this before. "Open the door," Catherine commanded. "Ma'am, it's not safe. There could be a fuel leak." "Open the door. Now. That's an order." The air stairs lowered. Catherine walked down into the heat and the smell of burnt rubber. She ignored the fire chief. She ignored her assistants who were already talking about PR statements. She walked straight toward Daniel Ross. The security guards moved to pull Daniel away, but Catherine raised a hand. "Let him go. Uncuff him." "Ma'am, he breached the perimeter. He's a security risk," Henderson began. "He's the reason I'm still breathing, Henderson. Uncuff him or you're fired before he hits the ground." The handcuffs clicked open. Daniel rubbed his wrists, his gaze meeting Catherine's. He didn't look like a disgruntled employee. He looked like an architect who had just watched his masterpiece nearly crumble. "You said it wouldn't work," Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper, the coldness finally gone. "The angle of the valve," Daniel said, his voice steady. "Your system is programmed to ignore micro vibrations below a certain hertz. But when you hit takeoff thrust, the resonance matches the fuel line frequency. It creates a vacuum leak. One spark from the igniter, likely a static discharge, and that wing becomes a blowtorch." The young engineer Marcus ran up, his face as white as a sheet. "He's right. We just pulled the black box data. The temperature in the wing root spiked to 800 degrees in 4 seconds. If they had rotated, if the landing gear had retracted, the fire would have reached the main tank in 10 seconds. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Catherine knew. Catherine looked at Daniel. She saw the man she had dismissed. She saw the lowly mechanic who didn't belong in her world. "Twist 1, Marcus whispered to Catherine. "I just looked up his full file. This isn't just a mechanic. This is Daniel Ross. He was the lead safety architect for the original Astra Wing prototype 10 years ago. He designed the very airframe we're sitting on." Catherine froze. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "Why is he working a morning shift as a tech?" "Because he resigned 6 years ago," Marcus replied. "He refused to sign off on a cost-cutting measure for the engine mounts that Vale Global pushed through. He chose his integrity over his career. He disappeared into the maintenance crews so he could stay close to the planes and keep his daughter in the same school." Catherine turned back to Daniel. The silence on the runway was absolute. She realized that the system she trusted, the protocols, the experts, the expensive software, had almost killed her. The only thing that saved her was the one thing she had tried to remove from the equation, a human being with a conscience. "I saw your report from last week," Catherine said, her voice cracking for the first time. "It was on my desk. I was the one who marked it as non-urgent. I thought I was being efficient. I thought I was being a CEO. "You were being a manager, Ms. Vale," Daniel said quietly. "A leader listens to the people on the ground. A leader knows that the smallest bolt can take down the biggest ego." She looked at the smoking wing, then back at Daniel. "The flight is canceled. Zurich can wait. I need you to show me exactly how we fix this. Not just the valve, the whole culture of this company." "I have to pick up my daughter in 2 hours," Daniel said, glancing at his watch. Catherine didn't hesitate. "Then we'll use my personal car. Henderson, get Mr. Ross's things. And after that, we're going to talk about your new position as the global head of safety for Vale Aerospace. And Daniel, this time you have the final signature. No overrides." Daniel looked at her, then at the jet. He saw the change in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a titan. It was the look of a person who had just seen the edge of the cliff and realized she wasn't alone. "Thank you," Catherine said. "Thank you for stopping us." The following weeks were a whirlwind of change that Astra Wing Executive Airport had never seen. The Vale departure was no longer a symbol of cold efficiency, but a case study in corporate transformation. In her first address to the entire company, broadcasted to every hangar and office globally, Catherine Vale did something no one expected. She apologized. She stood in front of hundreds of employees and admitted that her efficiency had almost become a tragedy. She introduced Daniel not as a mechanic, but as the conscience of Vale Aerospace. Daniel's first act as safety advisor wasn't to buy more software. It was to implement the human override protocol. Under the new rules, any technician, regardless of rank, had the authority to red tag an aircraft if they felt something was wrong. No questions asked, no punishment for being too safe. The computer sees the numbers, Daniel told a group of young engineers. But you see the vibration, you feel the heat. From now on, your gut is a primary instrument. The young engineers who used to hide behind their tablets were now encouraged to spend 4 hours a day on the hangar floor, getting their hands dirty alongside the veteran techs. They were taught to listen to the machines, not just the data. They were taught that a green board is only as good as the person who verified it. Catherine changed too. She stopped asking how fast and started asking how sure. She moved her office from the top floor of the downtown skyscraper to a glass-walled suite overlooking the maintenance hangars. She wanted to be close to the heartbeat of the operation. She replaced her assistant's market tracking screens with live safety feeds. One afternoon, Daniel brought Mia to the hangar. Catherine, the woman who used to ignore anyone without a suit, knelt down on the concrete to shake the 8-year-old's hand. "Your dad is a very important man, Mia," Catherine said with a genuine smile. "He teaches us how to hear things that everyone else ignores." "I know," Mia said proudly. "He hears the birds before they even wake up." The merger in Zurich was eventually signed. It happened 3 weeks late, but it was the most successful deal in the company's history. The delay hadn't cost them the deal. It had gained them a reputation for integrity. The industry took notice. The Vale standard became the new gold standard for aerospace safety. Daniel Ross still wore his jumpsuit, though it was cleaner now. He didn't want the fancy titles or the corner office. He wanted to be the man on the ground. He wanted to be the one who ensured that every father who went up in those metal birds came back home to his daughter. The sunset over Astra Wing was a brilliant orange as the first jet under the new protocol prepared for takeoff. Daniel stood at the fence, his hand on the metal. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Catherine. "Everything is green, but I'm waiting for your go anyway." Daniel watched the wing route. He listened to the engine surge. He felt the air. There was no vibration, no micro shudder. He typed back, "She's singing perfectly. Have a safe flight." The world didn't change overnight, but the world of Astra Wing did. Catherine Vale no longer walked through the airport with a wall of assistants. She walked with her eyes open. She stopped by the break room to ask the morning shift about the weather and their families. She learned the names of the guards at the gate. She realized that a company isn't a machine. It's a community of experts, each holding a different piece of the truth. Daniel Ross became a legend in the industry. But to him, the greatest victory was the look in Mia's eyes when he picked her up from school, on time, every single day. He had found a way to belong to both worlds. He was the man who could talk to CEOs and mechanics with the same level of respect. The young engineer Marcus, who had almost signed off on the disaster, was now Daniel's right-hand man. He no longer looked at his tablet as a Bible. He looked at it as a tool. He had learned that the most important sensor in the world is the human heart. The final scene takes place a year later. A new prototype is sitting on the runway. It's the Ross Vale 1. It's the safest aircraft ever built. Catherine and Daniel are standing together at the edge of the runway. "Do you remember what I told you that morning?" Catherine asked, looking at the horizon. "You said I didn't belong here," Daniel recalled with a small smile. "I was wrong," she said, turning to him. "The truth is, without people like you, none of this belongs here. We were just building monuments to our own egos, forgetting that we were actually building vessels for people's lives." They watched the jet take off. It didn't shudder. It didn't vibrate. It simply climbed into the sky, a perfect fusion of engineering and intuition. As they walked back toward the hangar, the shadows grew long on the concrete. The sound of the airport was no longer a discordant scream. It was a rhythmic, purposeful hum. Daniel Ross, the single dad who was once pushed out, now stood at the center of it all. He had taught a giant to listen. He had turned a lowly job into a sacred duty. And as the last light of the sun faded, the message was clear to everyone who worked at Astrowing. No matter who you are, no matter what you wear, if you have the courage to speak the truth, you belong exactly where you are. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Kind Single Father. Real heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just carry a toolbox.